The night was alive with fire. Not the fire of a hearth, not the fire of hope, but the fire of hell. In the freezing grip of March 1945, along the dark, icy banks of the Rhine River, the German defenders huddled in the ruins of shattered towns, believing their rivers were barriers, believing their panzer tanks, their MG-42s, their deadly Messerschmitt fighters were enough to stop the unstoppable. They didn't know. They had no idea what was coming, because the Allies had a secret, a weapon that moved like a ghost across water, impervious to the river's wrath. Amphibious duck trucks. Simple, steel-skinned miracles. And on this night, they would carry American soldiers into history and into the nightmares of their enemies. The war had already devoured Europe. Hitler's vision of conquest lay in ruin. Stalingrad had burned like a furnace of human misery, freezing bodies stacked on streets like lumber. Normandy's beaches were soaked with blood, bodies swallowed by tides that would never forgive. Berlin was under siege in the shadows, the Red Army battering at its gates. And the Rhine was supposed to be Germany's last line of defense. Its waters ran fast, cold and cruel, and yet across them a reckoning was coming that no Wehrmacht officer could have imagined. Eisenhower paced the command tent like a caged lion, his eyes sharp, calculating, and heavy with the weight of every life he commanded. Churchill's voice echoed over the radio, a rumbling call to push harder, strike faster. Stalin's armies were already hammering east, but in the west the Allies had to cross. And for months they had been planning, engineering, improvising, building a fleet of ducks, amphibious, invincible. Ironclad ducks that could float over water, churn through mud, and drop American soldiers into enemy lines with terrifying precision. To the German defenders, nothing would warn them. No shelling, no bomber raids, nothing. Only the sudden thunder of steel and men appearing where they were sure none could arrive. On the morning of March 24, 1945, the river seemed calm, deceptively calm. Fog curled like smoke across the banks, swallowing towns in a grey hush. From behind the lines, German troops peered through binoculars, scanning the mist, listening for engines, waiting. But Eisenhower had a different kind of madness at work. General Courtney, Hodges' First Army, had orders, and across the Rhine, the ducks waited like metal crocodiles beneath the shroud of dawn. The soldiers inside those amphibious trucks were young, 19, 20, 21 years old, and they had already seen the grotesque face of war. Some had stormed Omaha Beach, waded through hedgerows in Normandy, smelled the smoke of Bastogne in Belgium, and yet tonight, in the chilling mist of the Rhine, fear had a new texture. It was silent. It was thick. It pressed against their skin like wet cloth. They could hear the water lap at the banks, the distant rumble of German artillery testing their nerves. One private whispered to another, "If we don't make it across," but the sentence died in his throat. No one dared finish it, and then the river moved with men in it. Ducks' engines thrumming like a heartbeat pierced the fog. They were ducks in name only, but beasts in action. Each one carried a squad, rifles loaded, grenades strapped, nerves taut as piano wire. The Germans saw nothing at first. A shadow, a trick of the mist. Then bullets began to fly. MG-42s spat death, Panzerfausts loomed, artillery shook the earth like judgment itself. But the ducks kept coming, gliding, floating, unstoppable. American soldiers crouched in the beds, faces pale, hands gripping steel. And when they hit the far shore, they surged forward like a tidal wave of human fury. It was chaos, pure chaos. A lieutenant remembered later. It was like the world had been ripped in two. The river was behind us, death was ahead, and yet we ran anyway. The German defenders were stunned. Their rivers, their tanks, their strategies, all meaningless against the silent, floating beasts carrying men who refused to die. Some tried to retreat, others fired blindly. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the acrid smell of cordite. And above it all, the ducks, humble trucks with a terrifying destiny, continued their relentless glide. Across Europe, the war had been a theater of unimaginable brutality. From Pearl Harbor's sudden shock to the blistering skies over Dresden, the world had learned the cost of modern warfare. Soldiers in the Pacific island-hopping campaign saw entire battalions vanish under kamikaze fire. In Europe, armored columns crushed everything in their path, from the frozen streets of Moscow to the sands of Normandy. Yet, in that frozen moment along the Rhine, the scale of ingenuity collided with desperation. The Germans had fortified the river with everything they had: mines, gun emplacements, machine guns. But nothing could anticipate men arriving in floating steel coffins that were somehow alive, somehow unstoppable. Hitler, in his bunker, ranted to empty walls. Rommel was long dead, suicide under a cloak of forced loyalty. Eisenhower's signature was on plans that would define history. Soldiers were not chess pieces. They were young men drenched in fear and courage, walking through fire and water, knowing every heartbeat could be their last. Some cried, some laughed, some prayed, and all of them ran forward. The first squads hit the shore. Rifle fire tore through the mist. A panzer tank turned its turret, shells screaming, exploding in the water. But the ducks were already past. They hugged the bank, unloading men into the chaos. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the villages lining the Rhine. American soldiers fought with bayonets, grenades, and sheer desperation. German defenders, many still believing their river was a shield, faced an enemy that had broken the rules of war, the rules of reality itself. Bodies fell. Smoke rose. The river reflected it all in a dark, trembling mirror. And yet this was only the beginning. The ducks kept coming, a relentless wave. American artillery pounded from behind, covering every inch of riverbank, every crossing point. Each explosion, each scream, each gunshot became part of a symphony of destruction, of liberation, of sheer human endurance. The soldiers inside the ducks felt a strange unity with the machine. Steel and men became one. And as they surged forward, the German lines began to crack, panic spreading like wildfire among those who had believed the Rhine would save them. In one town, an American sergeant recalled the moment he stepped onto the far shore. "I saw them running, and I knew we had broken them, not just their lines, but their will." For hours the battle raged. Night tried to fall. The river, once a placid protector, became a graveyard. Every duck that crossed carried stories of fear, courage, luck, and death. Each truck was a witness, each soldier a participant in a war that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And then, as the day began to fade, the command realized something terrifying. The Rhine was only the first of many barriers. Ahead lay fortified cities, more tanks, more gunfire, more rivers. Every victory here would demand another crossing, another wave of courage and steel. And still the ducks waited, engines humming, shadows in the mist, ready to carry the next wave of men into history and into hell. Across Europe, the war moved toward its climax. Hitler's dream was crumbling. The Allies were unstoppable. Yet in that one moment, on that one mist-shrouded morning along the Rhine, the world glimpsed a new kind of warfare. Not just the clash of armies, but the collision of human ingenuity, courage, and raw terror. And in the minds of the German defenders, one question burned. How did they get there? How could men cross the Rhine in silence, in steel, in inevitability? The answer would haunt them forever. The river had swallowed the morning mist, leaving only smoke, fire, and the echoes of screaming men. Across the shattered towns of the Rhine, the Germans stumbled backward, eyes wide, hearts hammering. They had been trained to fight, to defend, to believe in the invincibility of their panzer divisions, their machine guns, their fortified bridges. But nothing in doctrine, nothing in years of tactical study could have prepared them for the onslaught they now faced. Ducks, these simple, unassuming amphibious trucks, had become instruments of chaos, defying logic, mocking the notion of a river as a barrier. Every time one touched the water, every time another soldier hit the far bank, the illusion of safety crumbled further. Inside the first waves, the young Americans pressed forward. Private Henry Thompson, 19, remembered the smell of cordite, mud, and wet steel. I thought I was going to die 100 times before my boots even touched the shore, he would say later, voice trembling. His squad's duck had been hit by a Panzerfaust, the blast tearing through the hull. Metal screamed, water splashed over the sides, and for a moment the river seemed to claim him. Yet they survived. Somehow, barely, they crawled out, dragged themselves into the mud and fired back. The German defenders had learned too late that there was no mercy in this fight. Only fury, only motion, only relentless advance. The towns lining the Rhine were eerily familiar, yet transformed into nightmares. Cobblestone streets, once quaint, were now traps. Roofs had been shattered by artillery, church spires toppled like giant toys. Smoke curled from every window, filling the air with acrid black that strung eyes and lungs alike. German soldiers fired from basements, attics, behind crumbling walls, their voices raw with terror. They came from the water, how? One shouted, voice cracking. Another panicked officer tried to rally his men, waving a bloodied map, barking orders that were already obsolete. Across every block, every ruined building, the same story played out. Young Americans, carried by ducks, spilling onto the banks like an unstoppable tide, ripping through defenses with the audacity of men who had nowhere to run but forward. Eisenhower watched the reports with a mix of calculated focus and cold dread. The ducks had been experimental once, a gamble, a whisper among engineers and planners, and now they were writing history in mud and blood. Churchill, listening from London, felt the tension in his chest tighten. The Allies had trained men to fight in beaches, in hedgerows, even in cities, but rivers had always been a limit. Not anymore. Stalin's armies were advancing from the east, but in this moment, the West showed a different kind of brilliance. Small machines carrying brave men across impossible obstacles. The Germans tried counterattacks. Panzer divisions roared, shelling the banks. Messerschmitt fighters tore through the sky, strafing troops and trucks alike. Mortar rounds fell with a shriek, carving craters into streets and fields. But for every duck destroyed, 3 more emerged from the mist. Engineers had ensured these trucks were more than simple transport. They were armored, adaptable, survivable. And every landing produced a new foothold, a new pocket of chaos for the German forces to contend with. In the chaos, individual stories unfolded, gripping, horrifying, unforgettable. Sergeant William Bill Harrow had watched his friend, Private Daniels, get knocked from a duck by machine gun fire. Daniels disappeared beneath the icy water, his hand reaching up for help that would never come. Bill didn't stop. He didn't pause. He ran forward, dragging another wounded man behind him, firing a rifle with one hand and gripping life with the other. Around him, the screams blended with artillery fire, shouts of command, the roar of engines, and the river's angry current. Every step was survival, every breath a miracle. Some German officers tried to organize resistance, but panic had spread faster than the bullets. Fear was contagious, and the illusions of invincibility shattered with every American soldier that landed. Major Klaus Reinhardt, commanding a small garrison, recorded in his journal later, "We knew the river could stop them. We had thought ourselves safe, but the men crossed it as if it were dry land. It was not a defeat, it was annihilation." And in towns from Cologne to Mainz, the same pattern repeated. German soldiers fell, fled, or surrendered. The Rhine was no longer a defense, it was a stage, and the Americans the actors of relentless destiny. The ducks themselves became legends that day. One soldier described it as like the trucks were alive, like they knew the river and hated the enemy. They moved with a rhythm almost human, gliding past artillery and machine gun fire, unbent by explosions, unafraid of death. In some cases, men in the trucks shot back while navigating through waves of gunfire, turning the vehicles into moving fortresses. Each crossing was a ballet of violence, improvisation, and sheer luck. And every soldier who emerged onto the far bank added to the pressure on German lines, pushing, breaking, and eroding the last vestiges of order. Far from the Rhine, Hitler's bunker became a mausoleum of despair. He ranted, raved, and ordered impossible countermeasures. The Führer's obsession with stopping the Allies had become unhinged. Orders came too late. Tanks were redirected like chess pieces in a doomed game. Artillery units fired blindly into smoke and fog, yet every attempt to repel the Americans failed. Every calculated move met with something unpredictable. A river crossing had never been so efficient, so brutal, so unstoppable. The Americans pushed deeper into Germany with each passing hour. Streets that had been quiet the night before now ran with chaos and blood. Families hid in cellars, terrified of the young men who fought with both bravery and desperation. German soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and bewildered, faced a truth they had never imagined. The war was not ending in grand battles, not with honor, not with strategy. It was ending with relentless, terrifying ingenuity and men willing to risk everything. In one town, a duck broke through a barricade, the driver a young corporal barely 21. The streets were on fire, windows shattered, smoke choking the morning light. He carried 20 soldiers, all of them shaking with fear and adrenaline. German soldiers opened fire, grenades landed near the wheels, yet the truck continued forward, climbing rubble, crashing through barricades. Soldiers disembarked into chaos, firing, screaming, running, and the corporal kept driving, almost hypnotic, almost invincible. By nightfall, the American foothold was secure, and the Rhine, the once mighty river, had been conquered. But the war was far from over. Beyond the Rhine lay fortified cities, entrenched panzer divisions, and the last desperate hope of the Nazi regime. Every duck that had crossed had left a scar on the land, on the German psyche, on the American soul. The soldiers who survived would remember the smell of the river, the taste of fear, the rhythm of bullets, and the machine that carried them into legend. And yet, for all the courage, all the fire, all the ingenuity, the Americans knew that each crossing was a gamble. For every duck that reached the far bank, others had been lost, swallowed by water, mangled by fire, erased by chaos. The river was patient. Death was patient. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the Rhine, another wave would have to cross. Another battle would unfold. Another chapter in the final collapse of Hitler's empire would be written in blood and smoke. The soldiers huddled on the far shore, soaked, covered in mud and blood, hearts still hammering. They could see the ruined cities behind them, the shattered villages ahead, and the endless river connecting the two. And in the mist, the ducks waited, engines idling, shadows in the fog, ready to carry the next wave of men into the inferno that Europe had become. And then, from the east, a distant rumble began. Not artillery, not explosions, but something larger, more inevitable, the Red Army, pounding toward Berlin, the final hammer about to strike. The Americans on the Rhine knew their fight was far from over. The Germans on the shore realized too late that their world was ending. The river had been crossed. And yet, the war itself was still alive. The morning light struggled through smoke and fog, revealing a battlefield that looked more like the edge of the world than Germany. Corpses lay twisted in mud, ruined tanks gaped open like broken toys, and the air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and fear. Along the banks of the Rhine, the surviving Germans were scattered, panicked, and broken, their illusion of control shattered. The ducks had done more than ferrymen. They had ripped the very heart out of the German defense. But the Americans knew this was only the first step. The Rhine had been crossed, yes, but beyond it lay fortified towns, entrenched panzer divisions, and an enemy that refused to surrender quietly. Captain Robert Lawson surveyed the aftermath from the roof of a ruined building. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He had landed on the far shore with his squad, fought through machine gun fire, and witnessed men die in ways no training could prepare him for. And yet, the look in his eyes was not of despair, but of grim determination. He knew that every moment he hesitated could cost lives. Every duck that arrived was a chance to push forward, to exploit the chaos, to strike where the Germans least expected it. The Rhine had been a line of defense. Now it was a gateway, a promise, and a curse. Down in the ruined streets, Sergeant Michael Mick, Hanley moved like a ghost. He had survived Omaha Beach, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Nothing, he thought, could have prepared him for the sudden, almost surreal efficiency of the ducks. They were simple trucks, yet terrifying in their power. They defied rivers, they defied logic, and they carried men who were willing to die. Mick had watched one truck glide past a panzer-forced blast, untouched, its passengers disembarking into chaos. He shook his head, disbelief and admiration tangled in equal measure. "It's like they're alive," he muttered. Meanwhile, the German command scrambled. Communications were fractured, orders delayed, and panic spreading like a disease. Hitler's obsession with defending the West had reached a fever pitch, but reality had overtaken ideology. The generals knew the Rhine was lost. They could regroup, counterattack, maybe even inflict casualties. But the surprise, the audacity, and the sheer mechanical ingenuity of the ducks had robbed them of the initiative. Every moment of hesitation cost lives. Every misstep brought another wave of Americans closer to their objectives. Across the river, the American artillery continued its relentless pounding. Big Bertha shells and 105 howitzers tore through buildings, dislodging German soldiers from their hiding places. Smoke twisted and danced in the dawn light, masking the movement of ducks and infantry alike. The Germans fired back, but for every bullet that found a target, 10 more Americans reached the shore. The chaos was total, complete, and yet somehow organized, a brutal symphony of war where every note was agony, courage, and death. Lieutenant Samuel Reed crouched behind a destroyed wall, rifle ready, heart pounding. His best friend, Private Jensen, had been hit by shrapnel moments before, screaming, clutching his leg, as blood soaked through his uniform. Reed didn't stop. He pushed forward, dragging Jensen to the relative safety of a basement, firing blindly at German positions. Every step was a gamble, every breath a challenge to fate itself. And as he looked out at the river, he saw more ducks, more men, more inevitability rolling across the water. The Americans were not just attacking, they were rewriting the rules of combat. The Germans had tried everything: panzer tanks, MG-42 nests, minefields, artillery barrages. Yet for every defense they erected, the ducks found a way to circumvent it. Engineers had designed them to survive small arms fire, traverse mud and debris, and even endure artillery near misses. For the first time, technology and strategy merged with courage in a way that changed the battlefield entirely. Soldiers who had trained to fear rivers, to respect them as obstacles, now faced the horror of men crossing them in metal shells, immune to expectation, immune to fear. In one town, an American sergeant named Frank Delaney led his men into a house that had been converted into a German strongpoint. Grenades rolled, rifles cracked, screams tore through the air. Delaney was hit in the shoulder, but kept moving, firing, dragging a wounded comrade with his other arm. The ducks continued to land more soldiers downstream, reinforcing his position, allowing him to hold the building against desperate German counterattacks. Each arrival was a small miracle, each landing a defiance of death itself. Meanwhile, further upstream, Colonel Heinrich Bauer attempted a desperate counteroffensive. Tanks moved into position, artillery fired, and infantry prepared for a coordinated strike. But it was already too late. The Americans had a foothold. The ducks had broken through the defenses. Panic had set in among the Germans, and coordination was crumbling. Bauer's men were terrified, unsure whether to fight, flee, or surrender. Every second of indecision was exploited by the Americans, every mistake punished with brutal efficiency. Beyond the Rhine, the war's broader landscape pressed in. Hitler's regime was unraveling, the Red Army advancing from the east, the Allies pushing through France and Belgium. The crossing of the Rhine was not just tactical, it was symbolic. It was proof that the Nazi defenses were mortal, that ingenuity and courage could overcome the seemingly insurmountable. And yet the Americans understood that this was a prelude, a single act in a much larger drama. The cities beyond awaited, Koblenz, Mainz, Cologne, fortified, desperate, and ready to fight to the last man. On the banks, the soldiers who had survived the crossings huddled, catching their breath, tending to the wounded, and scanning the ruined horizon for the next threat. Each duck that returned to pick up another squad was a lifeline, a promise that the river could be crossed again, that the offensive could continue. But the psychological weight was enormous. Young men, barely out of boyhood, carried the trauma of witnessing friends die, of stepping from safety into hell, and of being part of a war that had no mercy. The Rhine had been conquered physically, but the emotional battlefield raged just as fiercely inside every survivor. And then came the sound. Low, rolling, terrifying, the distant thunder of heavy artillery, the unmistakable rumble of the approaching Red Army. The Americans knew that while they secured the Rhine, their eastern allies were pounding toward Berlin. The Germans on the far shore understood too late that the war was collapsing around them. The river had been crossed, yes, but this was merely the first domino to fall in the final destruction of the Third Reich. Every duck crossing was a blow, every soldier a hammer strike, and the Germans could only watch as the edifice of their empire crumbled into mud, blood, and fire. And then, from the west, a new threat emerged. Reports came in of reinforced German units rallying, attempting counterattacks from towns thought already secured. The ducks had brought soldiers across, yes, but the enemy was far from finished. The next wave of combat would be even bloodier, even more desperate. The young Americans braced themselves, weapons ready, hearts hammering. The Rhine was crossed, the foothold established, but survival was far from guaranteed. The river had been won, but the war itself was still alive. The sun hung low over the Rhine, casting long shadows over streets littered with rubble and bodies. Smoke rose in black plumes, curling toward the heavens like the desperate prayers of the dying. The river, once a boundary, had become a corridor of terror, and the ducks, those unassuming amphibious trucks, had carried men across with a determination that seemed almost supernatural. Soldiers, mud-caked and bloodied, crawled from the water and pushed forward, their minds consumed by adrenaline, fear, and a single driving thought: survive, advance, fight, survive again. Beyond the banks, German forces were gathering, desperate to patch the breach that had ripped open their defenses. Panzer tanks rumbled through ruined streets, their tracks chewing through debris and shattered stone. Machine guns spat fire from every ruined building, every collapsed wall, every shadowed doorway. But the Americans were ready. They had learned the rhythm of this new kind of warfare. The ducks continued to arrive, each one a surge of men, firepower, and inevitability. Every crossing carried with it a new chance to tip the balance, a new push into the heart of enemy territory. Captain Robert Lawson advanced cautiously down a narrow street in a ruined town. He had seen horrors before, Normandy, Bastogne, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a town half swallowed by flames, civilians hiding in cellars, German soldiers firing from ruins, and his own men sprinting through chaos, their weapons spitting fire. Every corner could conceal death. Every building could be a trap. Yet he pressed on, signaling his men to secure the street, knowing that the foothold across the Rhine depended on momentum, not hesitation. In the alleys, Sergeant Michael Hanley moved like a shadow. He had lost count of how many men had fallen around him that day. The ducks had brought reinforcements, yes, but for every one that arrived, the enemy had another to meet them. Hanley ducked behind a collapsed wall, firing at a group of German soldiers trying to regroup. His heart pounded in his chest. Every shot could be his last. Every breath carried the metallic tang of fear. But he kept moving forward because stopping meant death, and retreat was unthinkable. The ducks themselves became symbols of relentless innovation. Each one glided through the river and up onto the muddy banks like a predator stalking prey. Inside, soldiers crouched, rifles ready, eyes scanning for every hint of danger. Explosions rocked the river as German artillery tried to pick them off. Mines detonated underfoot, tossing water and debris high into the air. But the trucks pressed on, carrying men into the inferno without hesitation. To the German defenders, they seemed like phantoms, unstoppable and omnipresent, appearing wherever they were least expected. Meanwhile, deep inside the shattered towns, civilians watched in terror. Families huddled in cellars, listening to the constant roar of battle, the gunfire, the screams. Some wept silently, clutching children too young to understand. Others prayed, whispering to gods they weren't even sure existed. And above it all, the ducks kept coming, their engines a mechanical heartbeat that announced death for some, survival for others, and chaos for all. The war had become a living thing, feeding on fear, courage, and the ingenuity of men willing to risk everything. Colonel Heinrich Bauer's counterattack had begun. German tanks moved into position along the hills overlooking the Rhine, their turrets scanning for targets, their engines rumbling like beasts ready to strike. Infantry prepared to retake lost ground. Yet the Americans were already there, entrenched, firing back with deadly precision. Every crossing of a duck reinforced the lines. Every wave of soldiers carried the promise of survival. And every foothold on German soil was a dagger in the heart of Hitler's crumbling empire. Lieutenant Samuel Reed moved through the carnage, dragging the wounded, firing blindly, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. His best friend had been lost to a sudden blast, disappearing into the river with only a scream to mark the moment. Reed didn't stop. He couldn't. Each second of hesitation could cost more lives. Around him, ducks glided past, dropping soldiers into the streets, reinforcing positions, and pushing the German defenders further into panic. The river had been crossed, but the battle was far from over. The broader war pressed in from all sides. Hitler's forces were collapsing, the Red Army advancing relentlessly from the east, the Allies pressing from the west. The Rhine crossing was not just a tactical victory, it was symbolic. It was proof that the Nazi war machine could be breached, that ingenuity and courage could overcome even the most fortified defenses. And yet, every soldier knew that this victory came at a terrible cost. For every duck that reached the far shore, others had been destroyed, others had failed, and countless men had died in the icy water, under fire, or crushed in streets now unrecognizable as towns. In one house-turned stronghold, Sergeant Frank Delaney's squad fought for their lives. Grenades exploded, rifles cracked, and the smell of burning wood and flesh filled the air. Delaney had been wounded but refused to stop, dragging a comrade with one arm while firing with the other. Outside, more ducks arrived, unloading men into the chaos, turning the building into an improbable fortress. The Germans tried to counterattack, but for every position they regained, another was lost to the relentless tide of soldiers and steel crossing the river. By nightfall, the Americans had secured key positions along the Rhine. Smoke hung in the air like a shroud, bodies littered streets and fields, and the river reflected the chaos in a dark, trembling mirror. Soldiers huddled, tending to the wounded, catching their breath, and preparing for the next wave. Every crossing had been a test of courage, endurance, and luck. The ducks had proven their worth, transforming the impossible into reality. But even as they celebrated the small victory, new threats loomed. Reports of reinforced German units approaching, desperate to retake lost ground, filtered in. The Americans knew that every foothold along the Rhine would be contested, that the next day could bring even more blood, chaos, and fear. And from the east, the distant rumble of the Red Army signaled that the endgame of Hitler's empire was approaching, crushing everything in its path. And then a sudden, unexpected sound pierced the night. Not artillery, not gunfire, but the ominous, metallic hum of armored vehicles moving through the darkness. The Germans were massing for one final, desperate strike, aiming to push the Americans back into the river. The soldiers on the far shore braced themselves, rifles ready, hearts hammering. The ducks were ready for another crossing, but this time the stakes were higher, the danger closer, and the bloodshed inevitable. The Rhine had been crossed. The foothold was secure. The Americans had survived hell itself. But as shadows moved in the distance, the young soldiers realized the nightmare was far from over. The night was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The river behind them roared silently, reflecting shattered buildings and the fires that licked at every ruined street. The soldiers who had crossed the Rhine were exhausted, their hands blistered, their lungs burning from smoke and gunpowder, their minds haunted by the screams of friends and enemies alike. Yet rest was impossible. Every shadow could conceal death. Every sound, a single echoing footstep, could mean a counterattack. The ducks had delivered them across the river, but now, on the far shore, survival became a different kind of hell. Captain Robert Lawson crouched behind a half-collapsed wall, surveying the streets ahead. Smoke obscured his vision. Flames reflected in shattered windows, making the ruins glow like hellish beacons. Somewhere, German tanks rumbled into position, artillery shells screaming across the riverbank. Every step he had taken that day had been a gamble with fate, every duck crossing a roll of the dice against death itself. And now, in the eerie quiet between barrages, he understood. Crossing the Rhine had been just the opening act. The real fight was about to begin. Sergeant Michael Hanley moved forward, rifle ready, eyes scanning every shadow. He had watched friends die in ways he would never forget. The boy from his squad, blown apart by shrapnel before he could even scream. Another, swept into the river, fingers clawing at empty air. The ducks had brought them across, yes, but for every vehicle that made it, another had sunk, swallowed by ice-cold water or riddled by bullets. Every landing was a miracle, every step on solid ground a temporary reprieve. And now, as dawn began to break over the ruined towns, the Germans were regrouping. Colonel Heinrich Bauer's desperation had grown into something almost inhuman. His panzer units were massing behind ruined walls, their engines throbbing like the heartbeat of a beast ready to strike. Infantry lined up in ruined streets, trying to regain positions lost in the morning's chaos. Orders were shouted, guns were reloaded, grenades primed, but panic had set in. For every German soldier who hesitated, another American arrived from the river, their rifles spitting fire, their ducks gliding silently behind them, unstoppable and relentless. The Germans had trained for every scenario except this. Lieutenant Samuel Reed advanced down a rubble-strewn street, dragging a wounded comrade. The world around him was a cacophony of fire, smoke, screams, and exploding shells. Every building was a potential trap, every alleyway a death sentence. And yet, the ducks kept coming. One after another, engines humming like the pulse of inevitability, carrying soldiers who refused to die, who refused to stop, who refused to retreat. Reed glanced across the river and could see more trucks approaching, shadows gliding through the mist. They were a lifeline, a weapon, and a force of nature all at once. The German defenses were crumbling, their morale shattered. The Rhine, once a formidable barrier, was now just a line of mud, water, and fire that the Americans had turned into an open highway. Each duck landing was another dagger in the heart of their collapsing front. Major Klaus Reinhardt wrote later, "We had believed the river was ours, our shield, our last defense. But they came across it as if it were dry land, as if death itself had abandoned them." It was not a defeat, it was the end. In the chaos, individual acts of courage and horror unfolded. Private Henry Thompson saw a fellow soldier swept off the deck of a duck by artillery fire. He dove into the freezing water without hesitation, pulling the man to safety even as bullets tore through the air around them. Sergeant Frank Delaney's squad cleared a ruined building, only to find German soldiers barricading the next street. Grenades exploded, rifles fired, and men fell, but Delaney refused to stop. He kept moving, dragging the wounded, firing, pushing forward into a nightmare that refused to end. The ducks themselves had become legends. Soldiers whispered about them as if they were alive, unstoppable, carrying men across impossible odds. They had survived artillery, bullets, and mines, and each successful crossing added to the mounting terror among the German defenders. Every time a truck touched the far shore, it was a demonstration of American ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to surrender to fate. For the Germans, it was a nightmare made real, a new kind of warfare that defied logic, strategy, and hope. But even as the Americans pressed forward, the broader war weighed heavily on them. Hitler's regime was crumbling, the Red Army advancing from the east, Berlin soon to be encircled. Every foothold on the Rhine was a step toward victory, yes, but the cost was staggering. For every soldier who survived, another had perished. For every building captured, another was reduced to rubble. The river had been crossed, but the battle for Germany had only begun. And then, as the sun began to rise fully over the ruined landscape, a new threat emerged. German reinforcements, desperate and angry, advanced from the north and south, their numbers swelling as they tried to push the Americans back into the river. The young soldiers on the far shore braced themselves, weapons ready, hearts hammering, knowing that survival depended on every ounce of courage they could summon. The ducks were ready for another crossing, but this time the stakes were higher. The battle would be bloodier, the dangers closer, and the margin for error vanishingly small. The Rhine had been crossed. The foothold had been secured. The Americans had survived hell itself. But the shadow of the war loomed large. The Germans would not surrender quietly. The Red Army was coming. And across the ruined towns and burning streets, the nightmare was far from over. Smoke choked the air, curling from the ruins like living shadows. The Rhine, once a boundary, had become a stage of death and defiance. The soldiers who had crossed were exhausted, their uniforms soaked with mud, blood, and sweat. Their eyes, wide and haunted, scanned every alley, every crumbling building, every shadow that might conceal death. Behind them, the river flowed cold and indifferent, reflecting the horrors of a world gone mad. Ahead, German forces were gathering, desperate to close the breach. The war had become a living nightmare, and the next act was about to begin. Captain Robert Lawson moved cautiously down a street littered with rubble, the smell of smoke and burning wood filling his lungs. Flames flickered from shattered windows, turning the ruins into hellish beacons. Tanks rumbled in the distance, their engines throbbing like the heartbeat of an angry beast. The ducks had brought them across the river, yes, but survival on the far bank demanded a new kind of courage. Every step forward could be the last. Every corner could hide a panzer, a sniper, a grenade. Hesitation meant death. Forward was the only option. Sergeant Michael Hanley ducked behind a half-collapsed wall, scanning the streets. He had already lost too many friends, men torn apart by artillery, swallowed by the river, consumed by fire. And yet he kept moving, rifle ready, mind focused, heart pounding. The ducks continued to arrive, gliding through the mist with a quiet inevitability, dropping soldiers into the chaos. Each arrival was a lifeline, a hammer blow to the German lines, and a grim reminder that the Americans would not stop. The German command struggled to regroup. Colonel Heinrich Bauer barked orders to infantry and panzer units, trying to patch the gaping hole in their defenses. Tanks rumbled into ruined streets, machine guns spat fire from crumbling buildings, grenades were primed, and artillery screamed in the distance. Yet every attempt to mount a counterattack met the relentless tide of American soldiers. The ducks kept coming, waves after waves, moving like ghosts across the river, their passengers carrying the tide of destiny with them. Lieutenant Samuel Reed dragged a wounded comrade through the carnage, rifle firing blindly at German positions. Explosions rocked the streets, sending debris flying in every direction. Grenades detonated in ruined houses, and gunfire echoed from every shadow. Yet through the chaos, the ducks pressed on, delivering soldiers into the heart of the nightmare. Reed caught sight of another wave of trucks approaching through the mist, engines thrumming like the pulse of fate itself. They were unstoppable, inevitable, and terrifying. The Germans had trained for everything, defensive lines, artillery, river crossings, but nothing could prepare them for this. The ducks had broken the rules of war, carrying men across ice-cold water, past mines, artillery, and machine gun nests, straight into the heart of German defenses. Major Klaus Reinhardt later wrote, "We had believed the river was our shield, our barrier, but they crossed it as if it were dry land. It was not a defeat, it was annihilation." Amidst the chaos, acts of courage and horror unfolded. Private Henry Thompson dove into the freezing Rhine to save a comrade swept away by a shell blast. Sergeant Frank Delaney, wounded, dragged another soldier through burning streets while firing at German positions. Every soldier was both predator and prey, each step a gamble with death. The ducks became almost mythic, carrying men into impossible situations, surviving explosions, and ensuring that the relentless momentum of the American advance could not be stopped. By midday, the Americans had secured critical points along the Rhine. Smoke hung thick in the air, flames licked at ruins, and bodies littered streets and fields. Soldiers huddled to tend the wounded, catching brief breaths before the next wave. Each duck landing had been a test of courage, endurance, and luck. For the Germans, each arrival was a dagger in the heart of their defense, a reminder that ingenuity and bravery could defeat even the most fortified lines. But victory was fragile. Reinforcements were approaching from the north and south, desperate to push the Americans back into the river. Every foothold had to be defended, every position reinforced. The soldiers who had crossed knew that survival depended not on bravery alone, but on discipline, timing, and the relentless machinery of war that the ducks represented. Beyond the Rhine, the war was still alive, raging, hungry, and unforgiving. And then came a sound that froze men in their tracks, a low, rolling rumble, distant yet terrifying. Not artillery, not gunfire, but the unmistakable approach of armored columns moving in coordination. German reinforcements were massing, determined to reclaim the banks, to throw the Americans back into the river, to stop the inevitable. The young soldiers braced, weapons ready, hearts pounding. The ducks were ready, engines idling, shadows in the fog, prepared to carry the next wave into chaos. The Rhine had been crossed. The Americans had survived the impossible. But the next wave would be deadlier. The next landing could decide life or death. The Germans were desperate, reinforced, and willing to fight to the last man. The war was far from over, and the banks of the Rhine would witness more blood, more heroism, more terror before the final collapse of Hitler's empire. And then, a massive explosion shook the riverbank. One of the ducks, loaded with soldiers and munitions, erupted in fire, throwing men into the freezing water. Screams cut through the smoke. Chaos threatened to swallow the landing zone, yet others pressed forward, engines humming, rifles ready, refusing to falter. The nightmare was far from over. The Rhine had been crossed, but the war itself was still alive, and it was coming for everyone. Flames tore through the morning fog, casting grotesque shadows over the ruined streets of the Rhine. Smoke thickened the air until it was almost impossible to see, and the stench of blood, mud, and burning wood clung to every man. The river behind the soldiers glimmered darkly, indifferent, reflecting the chaos like a shattered mirror. The Americans had crossed it, yes, defied its currents, its depth, its deadly reputation. But now the far shore demanded something even fiercer: survival, advance, and unyielding fury. Every step forward carried them deeper into hell, yet retreat was unthinkable. Captain Robert Lawson moved cautiously, boots slipping in mud and blood. The remnants of buildings loomed like specters, hiding German snipers, machine gun nests, and the occasional lurking panzer. Flames flickered through broken windows, lighting the streets with a hellish glow. Tanks rumbled in the distance, their engines a low, menacing growl. But the ducks kept coming, gliding across the dark river like metal phantoms, carrying men who refused to die, men whose very existence defied expectation. Every landing reinforced the foothold. Every soldier who made it across became a dagger in the heart of Germany's last defenses. Sergeant Michael Hanley's eyes were burning from smoke, his body exhausted, his mind numb from the endless roar of battle. Around him, comrades fell, some screaming, others silent in death. Yet through it all, ducks glided through the chaos, each one delivering men like a tide of steel and courage. Each arrival pushed the Germans closer to panic. Each wave turned fear into a weapon. Hanley ducked behind a ruined wall, rifle cracking with fire, trying to reconcile the horror of what he had witnessed with the resolve to survive. The German defenses, once confident and imposing, were crumbling. Colonel Heinrich Bauer barked orders over the roar of explosions, but coordination had evaporated. Tanks moved into the streets, infantry tried to regroup, artillery fired blindly. Yet for every defensive maneuver, the Ducks delivered new soldiers, new weapons, new momentum. The Germans had believed the Rhine would stop the Americans. They had believed in rivers, in fortifications, in strategy. They were wrong. The river had become a highway to death, an artery of war, a stage for inevitability. Lieutenant Samuel Reed dragged a wounded comrade through a street-turned battlefield. Smoke strung his eyes, and the roar of artillery made his heart pound in his chest. Explosions sent debris flying, but he pressed on, firing when he could, pushing when he had to. Behind him, another wave of ducks glided across the misty water, engines humming like the pulse of fate. Soldiers poured onto the banks, rifles ready, moving with terrifying determination. The river had been crossed, but the real battle, street by street, life against death, was just beginning. Private Henry Thompson dove into the freezing river to save a soldier swept away by artillery fire. Sergeant Frank Delaney dragged a wounded comrade through flames and smoke, rifle in hand, firing at anyone who moved. The Ducks, resilient and seemingly alive, continued their relentless advance, delivering men into chaos, unbroken by bullets, explosives, or fire. Every crossing became a story of courage, desperation, and survival. Every landing shattered the illusions of German control. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had secured key positions along the Rhine, but the cost was staggering. Streets ran with blood, bodies littered ruins, and smoke hung like a funeral shroud. The soldiers huddled, tending the wounded, catching brief breaths before the next wave. Each crossing had tested their courage, endurance, and luck. The Germans' morale had shattered. Panic replaced strategy. Every American foothold was another step toward the collapse of Hitler's empire. Yet even as the soldiers celebrated temporary victories, new threats loomed. Reinforcements approached from the north and south, determined to push the Americans back into the river. Every position on the far bank became a precarious perch over a pit of death. The Ducks were ready to deliver the next wave, engines idling like the heartbeat of inevitability. But the soldiers knew that each crossing would be bloodier than the last. Survival depended not just on courage, but on timing, coordination, and sheer will. Then came the sound that froze every man's blood. A low, rolling rumble, not gunfire or artillery, but the coordinated advance of German armored columns, massed for a desperate strike. Tanks rumbled through the streets, engines growling, gun barrels gleaming in the firelight. Infantry moved behind them, grenades primed, rifles ready. The Germans were determined to reclaim the banks, to throw the Americans back into the river, to defy the inevitable. The young soldiers braced themselves, knowing that survival would demand every ounce of skill, every heartbeat, every nerve. The Ducks continued to arrive, carrying men into a nightmare of fire, blood, and steel. Each vehicle became a lifeline, each soldier a force of inevitability. Private Thompson saw a friend thrown from a duck by an exploding shell, yet others surged forward, rifles firing, grenades exploding, advancing despite the chaos. The river had been crossed, but the battle on the far shore was a living, breathing inferno. As night fell, the horizon glowed with fire. German reinforcements pressed, artillery boomed, tanks rumbled, and the streets became a maze of death. The soldiers on the far bank huddled in shattered buildings, firing through smoke, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the next wave. Every moment was a gamble. Every breath was borrowed. The Rhine had been conquered, but the war itself was still alive, hungry, and unforgiving. Amid the chaos, the Ducks glided silently through the river, carrying more men, more hope, more death. Engines hummed like the heartbeat of destiny, and soldiers clung to rifles and courage alike. The Germans, desperate and terrified, tried to fight back, but each wave crushed hope, shattered lines, and reinforced the truth. Ingenuity, courage, and relentless determination could defy the impossible. And then, a massive explosion tore through the night. A duck carrying munitions erupted, hurling men into the freezing water. Screams echoed over the roar of artillery, blending with the gunfire, the panic, and the chaos. Yet from the smoke, more trucks emerged, more soldiers surged forward, unbroken, unstoppable, carrying the fight deeper into the heart of a collapsing empire. The Rhine had been crossed, the foothold secured. The Americans had survived hell, but the nightmare was far from over, and the war itself would not relent. The river reflected the fire, the chaos, the screams, and the inevitability of history being written in blood. And in that reflection, the soldiers saw a truth they could not escape. They had crossed the Rhine, but the price of survival had only begun to be counted. The world around them burned. The Germans clawed desperately at a crumbling reality. And the ducks, those silent, relentless metal beasts, waited for the next wave, ready to carry men further into history, further into hell, further into the pages of a war that would never be forgotten. The Rhine was conquered. The Germans were broken. But the battle for Germany's soul, for the very end of Hitler's empire,